Welcome, everyone, to the second session of the day. My name is Alyssa Crowell. I'm a senior staff attorney in the Transparency and Regulatory Affairs program, and I will be moderating this panel today. A few housekeeping comments before we get started. All sessions feature closed captioned subtitles. To enable this feature, click the upward arrow near the CC button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. Please enter any questions you have into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. The symposium is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with you later via email. Please take a moment to answer the poll question on your screen. If you're seeking CLE credits for the session, please click yes. Attorneys seeking credit will receive information via email after the symposium concludes. Okay, great. Thank you. Now on to the panel. Today's panel is on deregulation of the executive branch. This panel will analyze how deregulation efforts play out through agency rulemaking, enforcement priorities, and policy rollbacks. Each panelist will discuss their respective topic, and then we will transition to a roundtable discussion and then to the Q&A. With us today is Alka Channa, Vice President of Laboratory Oversight and Special Cases at the PETA Foundation. Amanda Hitt, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law and Graduate School, and Tala DiBenedetto, Staff Attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. I will pass it over to you, Alka, to get us started.
Super. Thanks so much, Alyssa. And thank you also to ALDF for hosting the symposium and inviting me to share my thoughts. As Alyssa said, my name is Alka. I serve as Vice President of Laboratory Oversight and Special Cases at PETA. I've been at PETA for more than 23 years. And for most of that time, I've worked on the use of animals in laboratories. I'm pleased to be here alongside my co-panelists to discuss the regulatory landscape, and in my case, focused on the use of animals in experimentation. I will now share the presentation that I prepared. Here we are. Share. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see it. The United States oversight system for animals in laboratories is not a coherent framework, but rather a threadbare patchwork quilt of inconsistent standards, loopholes, and limited accountability. We have the Animal Welfare Act, which is the only federal law establishing legally enforceable animal welfare standards, and it only covers certain species, which we'll get to in a moment. The Public Health Service Policy on Humane Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, which is the law undergirding that is the Health Research Extension Act of 1985. That applies to vertebrate animals, but generally only to those used in federally funded experiments. We also have institutional animal care and use committees, which are, as the name implies, institutionally based bodies tasked with reviewing and approving experiments carried out by the very experimenters and programs operated by their own institutions. Now, the Animal Welfare Act, it governs the treatment of certain warm-blooded animals used in experimentation, but it excludes the vast majority of animals used in laboratories. The AWA excludes mice of the genus Mus, rats of the genus Rattus, birds who are bred for experimentation, agricultural animals used in agricultural experiments, fishes, amphibians, and reptiles. And when you add it all up to the extent that we can, because there is no accounting for animals who are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act, it's estimated that upwards of 95% of animals used in laboratories are excluded from the meager protections of the Animal Welfare Act. Also, as was discussed very well in the previous panel, the law's enforcement mechanism is astonishingly weak. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is the agency which is charged with enforcing the AWA But even when fully staffed, the agency has only about 130 inspectors who are responsible not only for enforcing the Animal Welfare Act at more than 1,000 research facilities, but also thousands of puppy mills, zoos, circuses, roadside menageries, marine parks, and other regulated operations. With such a skeletal inspection force spread so thinly um, across the country, inspections can become they can be cursory, violations can be overlooked, and animal suffering can persist for years. Uh, in fact, audits by the agency's own Office of the Inspector General in 1995, in 2005, and in 2014 found serious failures in the agency's enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act as it applies to laboratories. There have been more recent audits pertaining to enforcement of the AWA at dog breeders. Um, Now, there are countless examples of the USDA's enforcement failures, several of which are documented on this web page that I invite you to take a look at. In one revealing case that I'd like to share, PETA had conducted an undercover investigation of a contract testing laboratory in South Carolina called Professional Laboratory and Research Services. uh, PLRS can find more than 250 dogs, cats, and rabbits. During the investigation, while our person was there at the facility doing her job, the USDA inspector came and visited. Now, at this facility that had 250 animals, the inspector spent 3 hours. This was for an inspection, for inspections that occur at minimum once a year. And that was about the frequency that PLRS was being inspected at that time. The inspector spent 1 hour speaking with employees, 1 hour going through paperwork and records, and she spent 1 hour examining the animals and the conditions they were kept in. Uh, the inspector cited PLRS for one Animal Welfare Act violation. Now, 1 month later, when PETA presented its findings to senior USDA officials, the agency was so alarmed by the documented suffering and systemic failures that it dispatched a team of veterinary inspectors to PLRS to conduct a more extensive audit. That inspection corroborated PETA's findings, and the laboratory was ultimately forced by the USDA to either surrender all of its animals or voluntarily shut down. And it did both. It surrendered the animals and shut down. But this just goes to show you that when you look at the USDA's database of inspection reports and you see facilities that are not being cited, or they just have one or two citations in the inspection reports, this does not mean that things are okay. There are problems being overlooked all the time, and animals continue to suffer. What happened at PLRS, it was not an isolated failure. It is emblematic of a chronically overstretched oversight system in which superficial inspections can miss profound and prolonged animal suffering. Now, I'd really love to share with you what happened with Envigo, which was a PETA, which stemmed from a PETA undercover investigation. This, of course, is a massive dog breeding facility in Cumberland, Virginia. And beagles were bred to be sold to laboratories across the US and around the world. But I'm going to leave the story to the discussion period if time permits. We also want to talk about a public health service policy and the agency that's responsible for ensuring compliance with PHS policy and the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, which are the federal animal welfare guidelines that are associated with PHS policy. Now, the policy, the guidelines, these are intended to ensure compliance with minimal animal welfare standards for vertebrate animals. So now we are including mice of the genus Mus, rats of the genus Rattus, reptiles, amphibians, agricultural animals, whether they're used for agricultural experiments or for experiments that will model what happens in human beings. So we're talking about all vertebrate animals, expanding from from the animals covered under the Animal Welfare Act. However, in most cases, we're only talking about experiments that are funded by the public health service agencies. So National Institutes of Health, FDA, CDC, and so on. Mostly NIH is the biggest funder. And what's really important to recognize also is that the standards that are applied here through PHS policy and the guide, these are not legally enforceable animal welfare standards. So if in a laboratory there are mice used in federally funded experiments who dehydrate to death because the water sipper wasn't working, or they drown because the water sipper wasn't working and the cage has flooded, or there are rats in a cage who are sent through the high temperature mechanical cage washer and they are scalded to death, or if there are mice who are not fed because they're overlooked and they starve to death. All of these egregious violations that represent extreme animal suffering, these are not legally enforceable standards. Moreover, the violations that I'm discussing here are largely hidden from public view. The National Institutes of Health's Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, OLA, relies heavily on institutions to self-report non-compliance. And that means that we're creating a system with little transparency and scant accountability, even for the egregious violations that I just mentioned. And so we're talking about immense and prolonged animal suffering. I think I mentioned, but I may not have, that OLA does not post the violations that are self-reported to the agency. Instead, it falls on interested citizens, not animal protection organizations like PETA, to submit Freedom of Information Act requests to OLA to get the case reports documenting noncompliance. And so we have done that in numerous incarnations. Most recently, my colleagues and I conducted a 2-year analysis of animal welfare violations at the 20 institutions of higher education that received the most NIH funding in fiscal year 2022. So we looked at fiscal years 2022 and 2023 and found that these elite institutions that received so much funding from NIH amassed a staggering 231 documented violations of animal welfare standards, with animals experiencing pain, injury, and death as a result of neglect, incompetence, and carelessness by laboratory personnel. We presented the findings. We presented our findings at an international science conference and subsequently published the analysis in the University of Louisville's Journal of Animal and Environmental Law. And I think the citation is right here on the slide, underscoring that even the nation's most prestigious and heavily funded research institutions repeatedly fail to meet even minimal standards of animal care. We want to talk also about the IACUC's Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees. These were created in the 1980s, or I should say that it was required that facilities that were covered under the AWA or the Health Research Extension Act of 1985 would have to have an IACUC. And this mandate to have IACUCs came about in response to public outrage over cruelty in laboratories through a couple of very high-profile cases. And the IACUCs were intended to serve as watchdogs, ensuring compliance with federal animal protection standards. In practice, however, these committees are often dominated by animal experimenters, and they are shaped by institutional interests, functioning less as meaningful oversight bodies and more as rubber stamps for the very experiments they are supposed to scrutinize. Let's see, and again, I should mention that the USDA OIG audits that I mentioned earlier, all of them criticized IACUCs for their myriad failures. The few responsibilities that IACUCs have in reviewing and then approving, since they very rarely reject proposed protocols, they're basically failing at their jobs to make sure that the few items that are there in the animal welfare regulations and in the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals are being checked off properly. So, when we think about all of this, there are certainly important reforms that could strengthen oversight of U.S. laboratories. We could expand the Animal Welfare Act to cover currently excluded species. We could increase the number of inspectors. We could strengthen enforcement provisions, such as was discussed in the last panel. We could improve transparency surrounding violations of PHS policy. We could reform IACUCs to reduce institutional bias. But ultimately, the persistent and systemic failures we continue to see point to a deeper problem, and that's the enterprise of animal experimentation is structurally flawed. And meaningful progress will require not simply better oversight, but rather a fundamental shift away from animal experiments and toward modern, human-relevant, non-animal research methods. To that end, we are importantly beginning to see meaningful change at the federal level. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act 2.0, signed into law in 2022, removed the long-standing blanket requirement that new drugs be tested on animals before entering human clinical trials. And that FDA Modernization Act 2.0 opened the door to alternatives such as organ chips, computational modeling, cell-based assays to be used in place of animals. Now, unfortunately, pharmaceutical companies have been a little shy to rely on these non-animal methods when they submit their data to the FDA. And so FDA Modernization Act 3.0 has been proposed, and these reforms would go even further by prioritizing human-centered testing approaches and requiring researchers to justify using animals when scientifically superior non-animal methods are available. At the same time, federal agencies, including the FDA and EPA, have increasingly embraced new approach methodologies, and the NIH, for its part, as the world's biggest funder of animal experimentation globally, it has significantly expanded its investment in human-relevant non-animal science. This year, NIH announced a $150 million investment in the development and validation of non-animal research technologies such as organ chips, AI driven modeling, and other advanced approaches. Now, we are pleased to see these initiatives and this investment, but at present, we are also very concerned and believe that the agencies need to proceed far more quickly and far greater urgency. We see that there's so much suffering inflicted on animals in laboratories. There's scientific limitations of animal-based models, and we need this transition sooner rather than later. So I think with that, I will close and thank you for your attention. I will draw your attention to this web page over here. This has references, citations to the various OIG audits and many of the other issues that I raised in my comments. So please take a look at that, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Elka. We will now pass it over to Amanda to hear from her.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, and thank you, ALDF, for having me here and also having me here with such great and esteemed colleagues joining the panel as well to discuss the important issue of deregulation. Just a little bit about me. While I am new to Vermont law and graduate school, I am certainly not new to the issue of line speeds. Line speeds and deregulation in the slaughter process is decades long. It sort of process, and I started in this probably around 2009, working with whistleblower inspectors and plant slaughter workers to better understand what they were seeing on the ground. Let me see if I can screen share here. Sorry. There I go. Hopefully everyone can see. So a few things that I want to discuss, big topics, sort of three main things is one, we'll just cover a little bit about the history of deregulation and slaughter speeds. And I will also bring up the importance of whistleblowers. And lastly, we'll get to see the overall through line of how we ultimately can deregulate without actually removing a regulation, but changing the very structures that make deregulation and enforcement practical. All right, so let's start with the very basic question, why do line speeds matter? That should be pretty obvious, but I think what's important to take away here is that this modernization for efficiency has ultimately reduced meaningful oversight. And that's not just to say that it's harder to see things when things go fast, but the addition of high speed into a slaughter facility, which is already one of the most unsafe places to work, increases the likelihood of what we can see here as worker safety. And certainly animal welfare risks arise where we see problems with moving animals quickly or even transporting them to the facility where injuries can happen. And then there's food safety and public health, and then the integrity of the overall system and the environmental burden. I see these are all very much intersectional, but exacerbated by line speed. So you can imagine, for instance, where you have increased production throughput, workers might be driving animals faster, so of course causing potential injury to the animals involved, but also to the workers themselves. Also, they want to highlight here that the high-speed slaughter sort of regime and rollout since the 90s is not just changing the speed of the lines, but it's also largely changing the structure of the facility itself and the placement of federal meat inspectors on the line, which causes them to be less likely to enforce effectively. And we'll go into that a little bit more. Starting with the traditional inspection model, which is now kind of under attack as we move toward faster line speeds, and how we moved away from it into the place where we are. Again, like I mentioned, this started in the 90s with the HACCP program. It's Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, which started to look differently at overall pathogen outcomes, not just as what the inspectors could see and evaluate on the line, but where in the production system you were most likely to have hazardous pathogen issues or control issues of the operation. And so that HACCP ultimately got morphed into pilot programs in both pigs and in birds, specifically broiler production chickens. And the pilot programs tested whether they not just a few things, but the pilot program is sort of testing can we run these lines faster? It also asked the question or looked at, must we have so much online federal inspection? The inspectors called this or it's not inspectors, but really everyone called it poke and sniff inspection. So they're like, well, maybe the inspectors don't have to physically be there, but maybe we could just increase pathogen testing and get the same safety results, public health results. And then lastly, this greater reliance on plant employees. And so the USDA, sort of in a reduction in force kind of mentality, started asking, well, what if the plant itself took over some of the operational activities that our federal meat inspectors were doing. And we refer to those plant employees in high speed models as the plant workers as I forgot the name. Oh, anyway, it'll occur to me. I don't know why I've lost that, but anyway, so they use these pilot programs in both poultry and in pork to justify broader modernization forms, which we will discuss. Oh, I'm sorry. The plant employees in this case doing inspector works are called sorters. I just skipped my mind, but of course, this was not without criticism. This is when I started. We were looking at the rollout to take hemp into a modernization. Started around 2009, starting with chickens, and then later, 2000, a little later, we moved into the same movement toward modernizing pigs as well. What we were finding working with whistleblowers at that point was this concern from meat inspectors that there was a reduction in wholesomeness. And I remember the early campaigns were like, well, I think the petition we did was something like feathers, pus, and feces in my chicken. Oh my, I think was what one of our campaign concerns. Because at that time, inspectors were very much involved in not just the safety of the food, but the quality of it as well. We were all very concerned that they were attempting to modernize these pilots using a very small sample size. And there was questions about removing inspection duties. So a lot of things that inspectors had traditionally done were now being done by sorters who had significantly less training than the federal meat inspectors did. So there was questions, for example, in pig high-speed line production, that the sorters were not incising lymph nodes, which is an area that inspectors used to examine to see if there was herd disease. And of course, there was a lot of concern about the overload, the speeds themselves, hurting workers and inspectors as well, and creating health issues for them. So moving ahead, so we did these hemp pilots, and now it's around 2012, and here comes the new poultry rule and the new swine inspection rule, MPIS and NSIS, and new poultry inspection system was 2012. I remember they launched that, and we noticed some key changes, and NSIS was 2019, but for both it was quite the same. That the key changes were that during this time is that the plant employees were doing the sorting and trimming functions, again, making it possible for inspectors to really identify disease, because at the point where the inspector was looking at the animals, the plant sorters themselves had already removed evidence of disease, which is causing a lot of concern. So we didn't really know about the overall health of the animals or any kind of disease that they may have had that was removed. So you can imagine if there was a suspect animal that had maybe cancer or what looked like cancer, that would be removed. But the inspector would not know that the animal had cancer. So you can sort of see there was nothing for them to be able to flag and raise concerns about. We also noticed, and this was very much the structural change of the system, not just the speed, but that inspectors shifted to downstream pathogen detection rather than identifying upstream hazards. So this is, again, a concern because, if you're really not getting the real view of just how bad things are or how sick the animals could be coming into the line. USDA started relying heavily on systems-based oversight and pathogen testing. So during this time, both programs were using additional pathogen protection because it was in a waiver at this time under MPIS and SIS, effectively, just trying to see how well it works. So they were doing a little more oversight on that, but problematically, that oversight was very much plant driven. So to ensure that the food, the meat was safe to eat, the plants were very much cherry picking very pristine pieces of meat or animals that came from very healthy herds to do that additional testing on. So as far as we were concerned, it was pretty much performative. And then the line speeds expanded. And then in addition to the increased pathogen testing, with concerns about workers and injuries that would be exacerbated by line speeds, there were also mandatory attestations about worker safety that were necessary to do the MPIS and NSI waivers and run at the higher speeds, resulting in a transfer of practical inspection power from independent federal personnel to the plants themselves. So again, you're not seeing any rule that says we're getting rid of federal inspection, but essentially it was the goal is to move these inspection duties into the hands of the personnel themselves. And this was not the NSIS, the use swine inspection system, was ultimately called to question in court about under an APA challenge, where there was a strong the UFCW made the case that despite a lot of comment and concern about worker safety in these high-speed facilities, the USDA did not properly consider worker safety. So we go from a hemp pilot to an MPIS NSIS waiver. Now we're going to go into the time-limited trial stage. And during that time-limited trial stage, there was a pulse study, which was a worker safety study that was done to see if, in fact, the higher speeds impacted worker health and safety. The USDA reviewed the pulse study, and in their determination, the line speeds did not impact worker safety, although that there are many concerns about that, including some that we understand from our meat inspectors, which is that at the points at which the pulse study was done, which included videotaping and attaching electrodes to the workers, those pulse studies were only done when there was sufficient staffing. Well, and the reality is those positions are rarely staffed and are chronically understaffed. So it's kind of questionable whether those were accurate. We also understand that many of the people that were included in that pulse study had experience working on in those areas during the pulse study, where we know that in reality there are many there's very high turnover in slaughter plant workers, and they also move positions. So throughout the day and throughout their work time, so it's not particularly accurate information that they were working on. And there are more concerns about pulse study that I won't go into, just because that could be its own presentation on its own. So what we see is in 2026, February of this year, after doing hemp, after doing NSIS, after going through the time-limited trial, the USDA decides it's time to go into a proposed rule about increasing line speeds. So we keep the line speeds that at 175, which is basically a third of a second for an inspector to review a chicken carcass. And that was established under the NSIS MPIS. And then the goal there is, from the USDA, is to expand the flexibility for higher speeds establishments. And the new swine inspections system is contemplated in these 2026 proposed rules as well, not surprised, which also continues the NSIS style, the same way that poultry does, but then removing all upper limits of line speeds altogether. That, as our inspectors have shared with us, gives an inspector roughly 3 seconds to inspect a 250-pound pig carcass. So we're not looking at a lot of time, and we're looking at a lot of movement and a lot of moving parts and a lot of interacting problems that are exacerbated by the speed. Of course, USDA justifies this. They have to, right? They say it's efficient, it's modern. These are all very great words. It allows flexibility for innovation, and most importantly, what they've come up with is that there are no significant impacts by speeding up the line. So let's see if that bears out in reality. Let's talk to our whistleblower insiders who are in the plant themselves. And just to give you a quick entry into whistleblower matters, let's find out why whistleblowers matter. So they provide us with the operational reality. There are eyes and ears on the ground. They provide the context that's very often absent from the agency summaries, in this case, very absent from the proposed rule. And they give us insights in how the actual system behaves under production pressure. And what they reveal is what happens when staffing is thin. And by the way, in poultry plants, both inspection is running understaffed and plant workers are also. It's a chronic and very real life situation. It's how it's kind of done. They tell us how inspectors are pressured not to enforce, and oftentimes are appealed when they do. So they're under pressure from the plant itself, and then not supported by their USDA supervision when they do take enforcement action. And they reveal that what cannot realistically be observed at high speeds. So that's sort of common sense, but a lot of times, not only the speed itself makes observation difficult, but often the obscuring of the animals from the inspector, or like I mentioned earlier, sorters trimming away pathogens before they even get to see them. And then overall, the difference between policy language and daily practice. So what looks very good on paper, sounds very good, reduction in, hey, there's no more there's no additional non-compliance reports, there's no additional worker safety matters, there's animal welfare is just fine, and there's no environmental impact is what the data seem to suggest to USDA. But let's take a look at what that means to inspectors and veterinarians who are on the ground. The truth is they simply do not have the time, chronically understaffed, to document non-compliances. So when the USDA relies on those no increase in NRs, what they're actually seeing is that the new staff, the arrangement of the inspectors themselves, precludes them from being able to actually get off the line and document what they're seeing as noncompliance. So they're just fixing it as they go, working with the staff and not documenting it. So that's a big problem. It seems like Alka was having something similar in her world as well. There's intense pressure against slowing and stopping the line, as I mentioned before, not just from the plan itself, but the supervisors don't want them to do it. And they don't want excessive stopping because it interferes with the plant's ability to do business. It's interesting, too, that the USDA in its proposed rule puts a lot of attention on the ability for the inspector in charge, the IIC, to slow or stop the line if they see some sort of production problem or excessive NRs. But inspectors tell us that IIC person is rarely designated and not often at the plants. So if you're seeing no NRs and you're seeing no line stoppage, it's not because it doesn't need to happen. It's because there's no one to do it. Veterinary coverage is the same. So, when inspectors need to be backed up and have the vet come and look, do a more in-depth identification of pathogen or disease, they're not physically there to do it. So that's not happening. An inspector and a veterinarian jokingly called it the Bluetooth vet because they're generally covering multiple plants and there will be no vet in any given plant for hours at a time. Again, we're just kind of reinforcing this again. The disease evidence is actually removed through the trimming before federal review. So you really can't write an NR, a non-compliance, if you didn't actually see it. So kind of a big problem with the data versus the reality, and difficulty maintaining meaningful carcass by carcass oversight. Again, not just because of speed, but because of physical obstacles often put in the way of inspectors' view. So we have an interesting juxtaposition, proposed rule versus reality. USDA says it improves in efficiency. Inspectors say it's simply reduced observation time. There are no significant food safety concerns, and inspectors say, well, it's practical limits on inspection capacity. Proposed rule says we're using data. Inspectors share something different. Maybe that data you're using is quite questionable and doesn't really reflect operational conditions. They say USDA says there's no significant environmental impact. Well, we know that it causes increased waste, water use, and pollution. But in fact, strangely enough, in the proposed rule, the USDA says there's no environmental impact because they don't expect production, they can't expect that the new proposed high-speed rules will increase production because that's not driven by the speeds, but by consumer demand. Yet in their very own economic impact analysis in that same proposed rule, they show that production increase is assumed to occur with the increase in line speeds. And one of the things they find is, hey, there's no additional impact on animal welfare going at higher speeds. But we learned from our inspectors that they actually have less time, their HATS time, it's their humane animal time, to go out into the yards and do what's called antemortem, or the inspection, or living animal inspection, while they are, even though they're mandated to do so, they're understaffed and they can't. And then many times they call them the pens or the yards, the inspector or vet is just looking out on hundreds and hundreds of animals, never getting a real look at what's going on. And as I mentioned before, sometimes there will be like a physical shield that inhibits the view for the inspector. Just some few closing thoughts. Again, this is decades long trend to faster production and reduce federal oversight. Whistleblowers remain one of our few mechanisms capable of really disclosing how these systems actually work in reality. And the debate is ultimately about whether these operational realities matches regulatory promise. And I believe we have a lot of concern that they do not. So thank you very much, and I will hand that back over to Alyssa.
Yes, thank you, Amanda. Last but not least, we will hear from Tala.
Hey everyone, and I'd like to start by also thanking all of my incredible fellow panelists and also ALDF for having us. Um, as a previous SALDIF president of my law school, I recognize all of the great work ALDF does to help those of us who are moving into the animal law space. I'm a staff attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity's Carnivore Conservation Program. Prior to being at the center, I worked as litigation counsel at the PETA Foundation, where I had the pleasure of working on Endangered Species Act litigation pertaining to roadside zoos. So I really believe the ESA is a really powerful tool, and we need to protect it at all costs. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent proposed attacks on the ESA. I'll focus largely on what we've seen since Trump's first administration, and I'd like to shout out all of my colleagues at the center who have done tireless work protecting the ESA and its regulations from repeated attacks. The ESA and these regulations are a really important tool for attorneys like me to make sure that species listed under the Act get the protections they need and maintain the protections they need. So a little bit about the Act. It is an incredibly powerful tool to protect animals. It embodies Congress's commitment to halt and reverse the trend towards species extinction, whatever the cost, and whatever the cost is really important. And the ESA has been incredibly successful at doing so. Studies show that 93% of listed species have increased or stabilized after obtaining protections from listing, and more than 100 species of plants and animals have been delisted or reclassified based on recovery or improved conservation status. The ESA covers plants and animals. Of course, I'll be talking about animals today. In addition to protecting populations and species and preventing extinction, it's also a really powerful tool at protecting individuals of a listed species from all manner of cruelty and harmful activity, whether it be sanctioned trapping and other indiscriminate forms of killing in the wild, or in the captive context. It can prevent really harmful forms of cruelty, and that could take the form of inadequate veterinary care, enclosures that cause animals harmful injuries, or even a court held that failure to take adequate precautions to protect animals from COVID-19. All of this violates the ESA, so we see the incredible breadth of this statute in protecting animals. So in terms of regulatory attacks, regulatory rollbacks, because we have this really powerful tool, it's often under attack. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what we've seen since Trump's first administration. So in 2019, we see these regulatory revisions that are really meant to narrow the circumstances under which the ESA can be used to protect animals, protect their habitat. We also see the introduction of economic considerations in places they really don't belong. So these bad regulatory revisions were brought under Trump 1. Following the change in administrations, the Biden administration ordered review of those 2019 revisions, and they did so in April of 2024. Those regulatory revisions removed some of the bad changes from 2019, but kept a lot of the others and added a few new bad changes. So that was challenged by the center and others, represented by Earth Justice in court. While that case was pending, we have Trump 2, where we get a new set of proposed regulatory revisions that were largely meant to go back to the bad revisions under Trump 1, but made a couple of new modifications, added a few bad things. But in great news, recently on March 30th, Judge Tigar out of the Northern District of California overturned 4 out of the 6 challenged regulatory changes from that case to the Biden 2024 revisions and the remaining parts of those 2019 revisions. And importantly, Judge Tigar noted that when he declined to remand the case, that it was important for the court to decide on some of these changes now, because it could signal to the agency some of the issues that, could be exacerbated by these new proposed regulations. So a little bit about the Act itself. The Act is administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, who is in charge of terrestrial species, freshwater fish, and some marine animals, and also the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is largely in charge of managing marine animals and also fish that move back and forth between saltwater and freshwater. The Act protects listed species. Species can be listed as either endangered or threatened, which are defined here. I'm moving quickly. We have a lot to cover. So to keep moving, where the Act really gets its teeth is Section 9, which sets forth the prohibitions. And the statute itself prohibits what's called take of an endangered species. It prohibits any person from taking an endangered species. So this can cover private individuals and entities as well as government entities. And take is broadly defined by the Act. It includes this whole host of activity: harassment, harm, pursuit, hunting, shooting, wounding, killing, trapping, capture, collection, or any attempt to engage in any such conduct. And even incidental or unintentional take is prohibited unless authorized by a permit. The statute sets forth situations in which private individuals or government entities can apply for a permit for incidental take. Section 9 also prohibits the violation of any regulation pertaining to endangered or threatened species promulgated under the Act. So we said this take prohibition under Section 9 applies to endangered species. So what about threatened species? For that, we look to Section 4D of the Act, which provides that whenever a species is listed as threatened, the Secretary shall issue such regulations as they deem necessary and advisable to provide for the conservation of these threatened species. And that can include any of the activity prohibited by Section 9, including that take prohibition. So shortly after the ESA was enacted, Fish and Wildlife Service exercised its authority under Section 4D to extend automatic protections from take to all species listed as threatened, unless Fish and Wildlife Services promulgates a species-specific rule, which is often called a 4D rule. I note that NMFS does not, National Marine Fisheries Service, NMFS, does not have an analogous rule. So let's talk about some of these species-specific rules. While Fish and Wildlife Service argues that promulgating these species-specific rules reduces regulatory burdens, redundant permit requirements, and allows the agency to use limited resources to provide the most tailored and constructive protections to species, we've also seen these species-specific rules used in some harmful ways. In 2016, the Center produced a report noting the escalated use of 4D rules to sanction activity harmful to threatened species. And so I'll highlight just a couple. For example, for grizzly bears, their 4D rule allows the take of what's called nuisance bears, including those that commit significant depredations to lawfully present livestock under certain conditions. These species-specific rules can also distinguish between protections for animals in the wild and those in captivity, as in the case of certain primates, where the take prohibition does not apply to those primates held in captivity and their offspring, as in the case of the lesser slow loris or the Japanese macaque. Or it can create carve-outs for things like incidental trapping incidental to lawful trapping of other species in the case of the wolverine, or make it easier for importation of trophies of threatened species like leopards. And so we see how these 4D rules, these species-specific rules, can be used to actually just sanction or authorize harmful activity to species listed as threatened. So, under Trump 1, we saw the removal of this blanket 4D rule, which extended those automatic protections to threatened species. And then that rule was reinstated under Biden, and now under Trump too, we see it proposed for removal again. This new proposed rule would include a new requirement that each 4D species-specific rule include what's called a necessary and advisable determination, which would include, concerningly, among other things, consideration of economic impacts in these rules that provide threatened species protections. Another concerning piece of this rule is that Fish and Wildlife Service stated its intent to create species-specific rules for those species currently protected under the blanket 4D rule. And so while I'd note that now it is more standard practice for these species-specific rules to be issued concurrently with a listing determination, there are plenty of species listed as threatened under the Act that are currently protected by this blanket 4D rule. And while the agency stated they would continue to receive those protections until a species-specific rule is issued, this involves the agency going back and possibly lessening protections for species that currently have full protections from take under the Act. And it takes resources away from the list of species currently awaiting protections. And finally, there's no regulatory assurance that these species-specific rules would be issued concurrently with listing. So you could encounter a situation where a species that's been waiting for these ESA protections through listing will continue to go without those protections, without that regulatory assurance that the species-specific rule would be listed concurrently. So it could certainly have negative impacts for threatened species who really need these protections under the Act. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about something we're seeing for the first time in Trump's second administration. We didn't see it under Trump 1, but a proposal to rescind the regulatory definition of harm as it pertains to take. So we noted earlier, take includes this long list of activities, one of which is harm. It is illegal to harm a listed species. Harm isn't defined by the statute, but shortly after the ESA was enacted, it was defined by regulation, and that definition has historically included significant habitat modification or degradation where it actually kills or injures wildlife by significantly impairing essential behavioral patterns, including breeding, feeding, and sheltering. So examples of this would be cutting down a tree that provides really important nesting habitat for an ESA-listed bird, or draining or polluting a water body that provides spawning habitat or a necessary food source to a listed fish, destroying through development an important denning site. And it's important to note that for so many species listed under the Act, habitat loss, and specifically human-caused habitat loss, is one of the greatest threats. And it has significant implications for animals and their welfare. In the Carnivore Conservation Program, we recognize that large carnivores especially need a lot of space, and they need space specifically away from often conflict. And so if you take away habitat that removes connectivity, you can severely limit these individuals, put them in closer proximity with people where they could be killed during conflicts, or if you take away areas where their prey depend on, where they can no longer hunt, they're more likely to go after livestock, which again will result in harmful killing. So this has far-reaching implications. So this proposed rule would only rescind the regulatory definition of harm. It doesn't propose a new definition of harm, so harm is still prohibited under the statute. We just don't have this regulatory definition. And Fish and Wildlife Service indicated that it would intended to limit harm, not to encompass only direct and intentional injury and killing, and exclude habitat degradation, which, the Act is very clear is one of the most pressing threats to species. And so hopefully we get to talk a little bit more about this, but this and other proposed regulatory rollbacks are the result of the fact that the ESA is such a powerful tool, and the Center is going to continue to fight these and other attacks against these regulations and make sure that the ESA remains the powerful tool that it is to protect animals. And with that, I'll end it there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We will now jump into our Q&A. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and you can send them over for us. So our first question is for everyone. When we say deregulation in the executive branch, what are the mechanisms we're seeing the most? Is it rulemaking changes, enforcement discretion, guidance withdrawals, funding shifts, et cetera, et cetera? And what tends to be the most impactful for animals? And whoever wants to start can go, and we'll go around from there.
I don't mind starting. I think I've spoken quite a bit about regulatory rollbacks, and they're a huge issue, especially with respect to the ESA again, because the statute is so powerful that under certain administrations, that is one of the tools to try and weaken it. But another one that I want to make sure to highlight is what I'm sure across the board is very concerning, which is rollbacks of staffing, which we've seen, which are really concerning, especially in the context of the Endangered Species Act, because for example, Fish and Wildlife Service has lost tremendous staff since 2024, and the ESA is a science-driven statute, so it needs a lot of scientific expertise. And we're seeing the loss of these wildlife biologists who have this expertise, who wear a lot of hats in terms of listing species, protecting their habitat, reviewing federal agency actions, and making sure that mitigation is in place to reduce harm to species. And so the loss of this staff is concerning. And not only the agency is primarily responsible for administering the act, but the ESA touches tons of different federal agencies, such as the U.S. Forest Service, because so many endangered species live on our national forest. And we've seen a lot of what we saw under Trump 1 with respect to using things like moving offices from one place to another to try and get rid of career staff, and through these, shutting down research offices, limiting that capacity, and then moving around staff. It limits the agency's resources. It limits the ability of these agencies to, undertake their responsibilities, and then possibly puts them in new locations where they may be more subject to political pressures.
And I would add for mine, because there's not, unlike this, just say, let's remove the reg, right? They're like, let's change the entire system so that you can enforce the regs. So for me, it's enforcement discretion. The practical limitations of inspections really are what's driving the data that USDA is using, giving them what visually appears by just looking at the data, like, hey, everything is safe, when in reality, there are so many upstream problems going on that simply are not noted.
And I suppose for animals in laboratories, the Animal Welfare Act, PHS policy, the standards have always been very, very low. And as I said before, even with full staffing of the inspection force at USDA, inspections can be lackadaisical, and problems are not found. So the fact that there have been staffing rollbacks at the USDA's inspection arm is obviously taking something horrible and making it worse. The silver lining in all of, and the fines have always been abysmally low, as the OIG audits have documented. When you have these corporations like Covance, which was bought by LabCorp, massive contract testing laboratory that has revenues exceeding $1 billion. And PETA does an undercover investigation, and the USDA does its job and looks into our findings, corroborates our findings, issues a significant enforcement action, but then fines the company $2,000, a company that has more than $1 billion in revenue. I mean, that was never good. It's never been good. Like, to me, the only solution here is we've got to get away from animals in laboratories. We've got to modernize. There's no reason when, this is such a failed paradigm, failing to produce cures and treatments for human beings. We've got to switch. So, the one place where I see a lot of optimism is that we are seeing that the agencies are attending to the science and, moving away with either regulatory requirements, like with the FDA and EPA, or with funding, like with the NIH.
Yeah, thank you. And the next question is for you, Elka. You just mentioned moving away from animal based methods of research. How can increased transparency about animal use and regulatory violations accelerate the transition toward human relevant non-animal research methods?
Thank you, Alyssa. That's a great question. What we know is that at this point, the majority of Americans oppose the use of animals in experiments. It's still a slim majority, depending on what poll you look at. But we've seen that there's polling that indicates that when people see that that animals are not treated as the other side likes to say, that they're treated so well, and there are stringent regulations, and there's a strong enforcement, and animals are only used when they absolutely need to be used, and they're basically living at the Ritz-Carlton, animals in laboratories. When the other side is saying things like that, and we're able to say no, wait a second, look at what our investigation shows, or look at what this whistleblower is showing us, this person who works in the laboratory, or look at what these records that we've received through FOIA or public records requests, look at what we're seeing here. What they're saying is a lie. It's a self-serving lie. And when we can, pull back, on this absolute fiction that animals are treated well, that there are stringent regulations, and say, no, animals are deprived of everything that they need. They're deprived of everything that's important to them, and their lives are unmitigated misery from the moment they're born to the moment they're killed. And, when we can show that to the public, we see that support for the enterprise decreases even more. So I think it's critical that we have transparency.
That's great. Thank you. Next question is for everyone. How do agencies justify their deregulatory moves? And are there ways advocates can rebut those narratives? Have you seen effective responses to shift the deregulation?
I can go.
Sorry.
No, please go.
Okay. This is actually important because one of the things Alka says, like, we need to modernize. Be careful what you ask for, Alka, because sometimes modernization is just a word that they put on deregulation, right? They're like, well, in our case, the modernization is, well, we'll do increased pathogen testing at the end of the line, which is the most detrimental thing to animals, because it instead of looking at the entire system as how can the system safely operate and maintain the health and safety and welfare of animals, how fast can the system go and give adequate inspection time and review, and make that like the container, like the controlling factor. Whereas our modernization is like, forget all that upstream stuff. Let's just make sure nobody dies when they eat it. So and I'm like you, Olga, but I'm like practicing a more diplomatic approach in my old age. I don't know, like I'm trying to be like, let's just assume they're just looking at the data, and they do deeply care about all of these things. The data just no longer looks at the animals pre-slaughter. The ante-mortem inspection just isn't adequately happening. So it's then that animals basically just get eliminated. Their welfare is essentially eliminated from the process, and it's all contingent on, well, does the end product have pathogens in it? So we're losing what's happening. Can workers, the other thing you want to look at is, can can the line operate safely for workers themselves? The US just doesn't look at that. they're modernizing by saying, let's stop that old school stuff and let's just use science to see if you'll die when you eat it. Not actually, no longer looking at all of the upstream harm that's occurred. And yes, there are people that care deeply about it. We have a huge coalition of people who are deeply concerned about those. And I would say that it's taken 30 years because of us. Not it's not a failure that we're at this proposed rule. I mean, 30 years of fighting this, I think that says a lot.
I agree. That's a great way to look at it. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I can say,
Oh, sorry, Tali, you go ahead.
yeah, in the context of some of these Endangered Species Act rollbacks, I think we're seeing more overt references to economic considerations, which are so, ridiculous because the ESA is so unequivocally clear that the purpose is to prevent extinction, whatever the cost. And so many parts of the statute really emphasize that economics really don't play a role in so many pieces of the act. And yet, with these proposed regulatory rollbacks, we're seeing references to the executive order unleashing American energy, which basically calls on these agencies to go and revisit their regulations that could pose an undue burden on domestic energy production, which really shows that this is a gift to industry. But again, you just have to look at the statute and the legislative history, which shows that Congress's intent was clear. This statute was passed nearly unanimously, and also public support. All of the studies show that the public is overwhelmingly in support of protecting endangered species. And so one thing that I've seen is very successful in the case of wildlife, protecting these individual animals is about protecting their homes. And a lot of these animals live on public lands. And so we've been able to, at the center, really stoke people's love of public lands and of animals to fight back some of the worst stuff, like attempts to sell off public lands that belong to all of us that we share with animals. And so I think the ESA is a good vehicle for mobilizing the existing public support. And I think people know that economics and businesses shouldn't play the role that this administration wants them to play in the ESA.
I'll say that from the perspective of animals and laboratories, back during the earlier administration, this has never been a right versus left or Democrat versus Republican thing for animals and laboratories. Frankly, all administrations have been bad for these animals. And it was during the earlier administration that that our adversaries were complaining about what they called regulatory burden. And I mean, they complain about it even with things like, what I alluded to in my comments earlier, that we don't have exact numbers of animals in laboratories because the other side has always argued that it's too difficult to count mice and rats. Forget that they say that they're trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's. They can't count the mice and rats. It's a very difficult scientific problem to do that, apparently. But this concept of, basically the agencies, the USDA, NIH, OLA, carried the water for the other side. They carried that water and said, yes, we have to reduce regulatory burden, forgetting that the real burden is carried by the animals. So my friend Amanda cautions me not to be careful of what I wish for when I talk about modernize. And of course, Amanda's always right. But I'll just say that when I say modernize, I am speaking about in the laboratory context, getting away from using animals and instead using human relevant non-animal approaches.
Great, thank you. And with that, we are at time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists, Tala, Amanda, and Elka.